Have you ever had an experience staying at a motel that was not what you were expecting? These 5 individuals share with us the worst of the worst. You might expect an uncomfortable bed. You don't expect to be stabbed in the middle of the night. Working at a motel in rural Arizona for 6 months, I was working the front desk one night when this guy comes in. He has marks and scratches all over his face. He paid for the room in all quarters that he had in a Ziploc bag in his pocket. I went back to reading when he walked out of the office, and about 10 minutes later, almost had a heart attack when I looked up from my book and saw him standing in the doorway. As soon as he noticed me, he walked away, and I knew right then that this guy was bad news. I felt incredibly uncomfortable. I could feel my face turn red as my heart started to pound. A minute later, I walked out of the office to look around. The guy was nowhere in sight, but I could see that the door to his room was open. Seconds later, I was facing the opposite direction of his room when I heard the sound of running behind me. I turned around to see the guy sprinting right at me. I froze in disbelief for a second and then ran back into the office. I slammed the door and ran and ducked behind the front counter, not knowing what else to do. Crouched down, I prepared myself, but the guy never came through the door. I stood up and looked out the window next to the door. He wasn't there. This all happened in the span of seconds, and I was honestly terrified. Shaking, I picked up the phone and called the police. They didn't take me very serious, but said they would be there shortly. For some reason I don't know, I called the guy's room. Did he answer? No. A woman answered. A woman laughing. The police arrived and searched the now vacant room. Never found the guy or a woman, but they did find a box full of brand new, unopened cleaning supplies. Working at a motel in my hometown, there was a particular room that was always unoccupied, and the employees would use it to take naps. One night, the place was almost completely vacant and was very slow, so I decided to go take a nap for 20 minutes. I went into the room and checked to make sure it was empty, and then closed and locked the door. I turned off the light and laid on the bed. The only light that illuminated the room was from right outside the window on the patio. I fell asleep quick. Not sure how long after, I felt someone sit down on the edge of the bed. I jumped up and was horrified. The room was completely dark, and I could see nothing. The light outside the window was no longer on. I jumped up and ran to the door, expecting someone to stop me, but no one did. I undid the chain and bolted outside. All the lights on the patio were now off, and I ran as fast as I could back to the front office. I have no idea who it could have been, but someone was in that room with me. I've come to realize working late at a motel that the things that shake you the most are not the weird noises you hear or the overwhelming feelings of loneliness at 3 a.m. The stuff that really gets to you simply being things that your guests do. There have been a few good incidents that have shaken me a bit over my tenure. An intoxicated man waving his gun around at 3 a.m. A woman having a schizophrenic breakdown in a room and having a violent dispute with herself, and a man wandering the halls talking to himself for hours on end. I can remember one incident that struck me as extremely odd. One night, a few hours after I had arrived for my shift, a guest kept coming down and aimlessly wandering around the lobby and breakfast area. He was doing extremely odd things like talking to himself and sitting down at a breakfast table only to stand up and switch chairs at the same table every 2 to 3 minutes. Every time I asked him if he needed help, he would jerk a little and mumble that he didn't need anything. A few hours or so after he finally went to his room, he came back down and said that he had turned his heater on, and it made him short of breath and needed me to call an ambulance. So even though I was confused, I obliged. About a minute later, the hotel's fire alarm started going off. The whole time the firemen were going up and down from his room, they kept asking if he had anyone with him or if he was alone. And I kept telling them that he was in fact alone and had no other guests in the room with him. After the firemen left and everything was back to normal, I went to look in the man's room. He had rearranged all the furniture, put the TV in the bathroom, and had put his trash can in the middle of the room and set it on fire. The thing that troubled me wasn't the fact that the man intentionally set his room on fire and could have possibly burned the motel down. It was the fact that even though he was alone, there were children's clothes spread everywhere around the room. A few years ago, I was driving from Texas to Louisiana to help my dad move when I stopped at this tiny, crappy motel right off the highway. It was very late at night, and it was the only option I could see. I don't remember the person who checked me in at all. I was so drowsy I could barely keep my eyes open. All I remember is sitting on the bed, kicking off my boots, and noticing that my room was connected to another room. I saw that the lock on that door was turned to the right, which looked like the locked position to me, and I fell backwards and passed out on the bed. At some point, I turned my body and laid on the bed fully. I don't remember when or how long I had been sleeping. Then, I was awoken in the most terrifying way imaginable. A sharp object was stabbed into my back. I screamed and rolled off the bed. I looked and just barely caught a glimpse of what looked like a very skinny man with long, greasy hair run through the door that connected our rooms. I was taken to the hospital after I ran into the parking lot screaming, and the paramedic removed a letter opener from my back. I never returned to the motel, and I have no idea what happened or who it was. I worked at a motel many years ago when I was 18. I was working the lobby one night, checking in guests, and this woman comes in by herself. She was wearing a big smile and was very polite. She was wearing a nice dress, and her hair was all done up like she had just come from a wedding. I remember these details very vividly because the motel was not in a particularly nice part of town. Hookers and drug addicts came in regularly. This lady was very nice and very out of place, but at the same time, she creeped me out. Her attitude was so over-the-top friendly and happy, it seemed fake or exaggerated. A couple times as she was talking to me, her smile completely disappeared and then came back a second later. She paid for the room and I gave her the key. About 2 hours after I had checked her in, she called the front desk. My manager answered and the lady asked to speak with me. When I picked up the phone, she made this extremely loud noise and then hung up. It scared the hell out of me because the noise was like a mix between a moan and a scream. I stood there completely shocked and asked my boss how she sounded while on the phone with him. He said she sounded nice and didn't make any odd noises. After seeing that I was noticeably on edge, my boss went up the stairs to her room. He ran back down the stairs a minute later and frantically grabbed the phone and called 911. The room was covered in blood and there was nobody inside.